chapter 3 today. Chapter 3 is the only chapter in your book that has 4 sections. So most of this week is pretty much just going to be notes and bookwork. You should expect your chapter 3 test next Friday. So we are starting your purchasing power. Today we'll do section 1, inflation and the value of money. Please make sure you title your notes, and tomorrow's note should be titled with section 3-2 and separated. And then later in the week, we'll do getting more for your money and consumer rights and responsibilities. Also, do not just copy and paste the slides. If you copy and paste the slides and do not make them your own, you are not going to get credit for your notes. There will be some things today that I say, do not write this down. If those are in your notes, you are going to be losing points. And you'll see why in a minute. So learning objectives, again, you don't need to write these down. This is just kind of telling you where we are going today. We're going to talk about inflation and how it's measured, the types of inflation, how they affect consumers, and the causes, and how other things are affected because of them. So do this, not that. You should ask for a pay raise at work once a year. If your raise is not greater than or equal to the inflation rate, then you are getting poorer. If your investments are not earning greater than or equal to the inflation rate, you are losing money. You want to save now to avoid having to borrow money later. If you do have to borrow money later, you want to try to pay off your debt quickly to avoid paying interest. You want to make rational buying decisions, not emotional ones. You want to buy your needs, not your wants. If you buy everything you want, you're not going to have money left to buy what you need. And you want to shop smart to get the best value at the lowest price. So these are just some of the recommendations. Most of these are on the first page of the chapter in your book. Some of them have been added on, but these are on page 73. Yeah, 73. Some of these will come up again in the slides. You don't have to write them down a second time. You could and highlight them. That just means they are that important that they're going to come up more than once. So what is inflation? Inflation is an increase in the general level of prices for goods and services. If you've taken econ or are in econ now, part of today will be a bit repetitive again. So inflation is an increase in the general level of prices for goods and services. So these are the videos.
What is inflation? Presented by WallStreetSurvivor.com. Have you ever heard your grandfather say, "When I was a kid, a burger cost a nickel," or seen a vintage sign selling a Corvette for $1,000? Boy, would it have been sweet to live in that time, right? Actually, because of inflation, it would be pretty much the same. Inflation is the overall rise in prices of goods and services in an economy. Here's Claire. Claire heads over to the corner store to buy a pack of gum. That pack of gum costs Claire $1. Fast forward a year, and Claire heads to the exact same corner store and buys the exact same pack of gum. This time, though, the pack of gum costs Claire $1.02. That 2% rise in the price of the gum is inflation. Inflation causes a rise in prices and also causes the value of your money, known as purchasing power, to decrease. Claire's $1 is worth less today than it did last year. In general, the demand for goods and services in an economy is greater than the supply, causing prices to rise and therefore inflation. Governments can control the inflation rate by adjusting the supply of money in the economy. Developed countries like the US try to keep inflation around 3%. Because your money decreases in value every year, it's important to grow your savings through investment. Learn how to invest risk-free at WallStreetSurvivor.com.
All right, and then this other one. Sorry, my Zoom bar gets in the way. Here we go.
This is Dave. Dave has his eyes on a beautiful 1978 Ford Pinto, barely used. It's a bargain for $24,000. In a world without inflation, Dave could simply save $8,000 a year for 3 years, and he would have exactly what he needs to buy his dream car. But what happens when we add 3% annual inflation, the historical average in the US? The price of the car jumped from $24,000 to over $26,000, an increase of more than $2,000. And that's the curse of inflation. Your money is worth less in the future. Take a common household item like a table. In 1913, the price of a table was $20. Today, that same table would cost you $470. That's an increase of 2,253%. So if your assets are in danger of being overcome by the rapidly rising waters of inflation, what can you do? How can you get ahead? You have to grow your assets faster than the rate of inflation. You have to outpace it. But if that's true, then bonds, savings accounts, and money markets are out because their rate of growth is just too small. Inflation will gobble it up. If you want to grow your assets faster than inflation, you'll need to invest in stock or real estate. Both have a track record of beating inflation. For example, historically, stock has earned a premium of 6.6% over inflation over time. So if you were to invest $1,000 today and earned 6.6% each year in 30 years, you would have $6,803, and that's after inflation. Or better yet, imagine that you invested $1,000 each year over that same period. After 30 years, your cumulative investment would have grown to $87,928 after inflation. And that should be more than enough to buy the Ford Pinto of the future.
Okay. So that gives you an idea of inflation. That second video there that we just watched, that's an introduction to investing, which we will get into in chapter 10, I think. So this is historical inflation rates. So you can see here in 2021, this year in January, the inflation rate was 1.4%. Mild inflation is good. So that video said 3%. I've also heard 2 to 3%. Inflation shows that our economy is growing. So you can see last year, as we know, we got out of school mid-March for coronavirus. Then places started shutting down, mostly after school shut down. April, May, June, you can see are all pretty low. The average inflation rate last year was 1.24%. Going back 2009, we were in a bit of a recession then. Our inflation rate was negative. In certain months in random years, we'll have negative. Just kind of scrolling way down here, Great Depression time, we can see from 1927 through 1933. This last column is the average. These were all either 0 or negative. So just kind of if you think what's going on in the economy, it should be reflected in the inflation rate, typically speaking. Okay. No, you don't need to write any of those numbers down. So we did those videos. So again, do not copy and paste this where your notes say videos. This is from your book. It's that same table. It's just the average for the last 20 years when your book was published. So do not write all of this down. I'm going to summarize this and the next slide. The next slide is even more daunting to look at because there's a lot more words. But that title there is what you really need to know. Inflation is measured by CPI. That will be on your test for this chapter. Inflation is measured by CPI, which stands for Consumer Price Index. I don't know if you want to highlight that, underline it, put a star. Inflation is measured by CPI, which is Consumer Price Index. Basically, the sentence there in the middle says the index represents a statistical average of prices for certain products and services expressed as a percentage of a base period. So they pick this base period. They could say, okay, February 2020, a year ago, how has the cost of a loaf of bread changed? How has the cost of a gallon of milk changed? So they pick that base period, then they compare the prices over that time. Yes, baby.
Can we go pee?
Go.
Can I go outside?
Yeah.
I saw my out there.
Sorry. Okay. So again, do not write this down. This just kind of goes into more detail. So basically the idea is there's this market basket of goods and services. There's 80,000 items roughly in this basket of goods and services in 200 categories. So like milk and bread, those would be in the food category. All these different categories, all these items split into these categories. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, what they do is they get approximately 7,000 participants, which isn't very many, to record and keep a log of everything they spend their money on. So they could say, I bought a loaf of bread today for this price. I bought it last week for this price. I bought it 12 days ago for this price. And essentially, they're probably not going to see if they're buying that same loaf of bread, any big changes. But when it jumps, they would be able to see that. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they get this data from these 7,000 participants, and then they look at how it changes over time. So that's how CPI is calculated, the Consumer Price Index, which measures inflation. You do not need to write that down. If you've taken econ, you probably already know that. And if you're going to take econ soon, you're going to learn this. You need to know that CPI measures inflation. Sure, it's good to have an idea of what it is. It's all of these things that they just keep track of over time, how the cost changes. And that's what that big old paragraph on the last two slides summarize together. So what inflation does is it affects purchasing power. Purchasing power is the value of money measured by the amount of goods and services it can buy. So just like in that video, I forget the name of that girl. She had $1. She could buy a pack of gum. A year later, she couldn't buy that pack of gum anymore. She lost purchasing power. So as inflation rises, your purchasing power falls. So you can't buy as much. Ideally, that's what it's saying in red here. You have to make more money each year to maintain your standard of living. If you don't make more money, your purchasing power is going to go down because inflation goes up. COLAs are cost of living adjustments. Some employers give COLAs to employees so that their salary will keep up with inflation to maintain the same standard of living. So a COLA is an increase in salary that's equal to the inflation rate. So if the inflation for last year was 2.4%, then your COLA would be an increase in your salary of 2.4%. That allows you to keep your same purchasing power. A raise really is when your salary increases by more than the inflation rate. If the inflation rate is 2.4%, but you only get a 1% raise, you're still losing purchasing power. So this table here, if this number stuff that I was just talking about makes sense to you, you don't necessarily need to write this down, because if I ask on a test, it would just make sense. If you don't know what I'm talking about and you're going to want this in your notes to refer back to, then write it down. So you have to get a salary raise each year that's greater to or equal to the inflation rate if you don't want your standard of living to go down. So if your salary doesn't change or the increase is less than the inflation rate, your standard of living will go down. You lose purchasing power. You can't buy as much stuff. If your salary increases by the inflation rate, you get a COLA, cost of living adjustment. Your standard of living would stay the exact same. And finally, if your salary increases by more than the inflation rate, your standard of living will improve. You have more purchasing power then. Okay, time value of money. This is a definition from your book. It is a concept that says a dollar you receive in the future will be less than a dollar, will be worth less than a dollar you receive in the present due to inflation. So if you lend your friend $20 and they say, oh, I will pay you back in a year, you're not getting really, as you're getting $20 back, but the value of that $20 is less. You'll be able to buy less for $20 in a year than you could buy today because of inflation. GDP, gross domestic product, is the value of all goods and services produced in a country in a given time period. It measures a country's economic performance. So it measures how we here in the US are doing. When the GDP is growing, the country produces more jobs and services, leading to more goods and services, leading to more jobs, more income, and a higher standard of living. The GDP must be growing by more than the inflation rate to represent real growth. So if the inflation rate is 3%, but our GDP increased by 2%, that's not real growth because that would be less than our inflation rate. Okay, so different types of inflation. Disinflation is rising prices with the rate of increase slowing down. So the prices are going up and they might go up more quickly at first, but then they kind of start to go up, but at a slower rate. Deflation is a decrease in the general level of prices for goods and services. So the opposite of inflation. Prices are going down for deflation. Reflation is high prices followed by lower prices and then high prices again. An example of this typically is going to be like gas. Gas goes up and then down and then it goes up again. Reflation. And then hyperinflation is rapidly rising prices that are out of control. So hyperinflation has never occurred here in the US. But what happens is prices are going up. So people buy and buy and buy because they're afraid they're not going to be able to afford it, which leads to more inflation. And then people don't have enough money to even live comfortably. So again, we've never experienced that in the US. There's no set amount. Economists kind of say around, if the inflation rate is 50% or higher, that would be hyperinflation. Following World War I, in Germany, the inflation rate was over 300%, and that was hyperinflation. So what causes inflation? There's demand pool inflation, where higher prices as a result of consumers wanting to buy more goods and services than producers supply. So again, the demand is high, they don't have enough, so they raise the price. It's often described as too many dollars chasing too few goods. So there's too many dollars chasing too few goods. Cost push inflation is rising prices as a result of rising production costs. So an example of this is when minimum wage goes up. minimum wage goes up, they have to pay their employees more. So they typically will then raise their prices, because if they're paying their employees more and charging you the same amount, you and I, then they're not making as big of a profit. So typically speaking, if minimum wage goes up and they have to pay their employees more, they're going to raise their prices so that they can also keep the same profit. Productivity is a measure of the efficiency of which goods and services are made. So it's a comparison of the total output to total input, like a ratio. How much of this are we producing? And what did it cost to make it? How many hours? How much supplies? So the productivity, that's how it's measured, the efficiency. So what are the effects of inflation? Inflation affects employment. Some inflation happens due to rising prices, which come from increased demand. If employers hire more people to produce more goods, small inflation may be okay. Like we said, a small inflation, 2 to 3%, that's what is considered good, because our economy is growing. So if we're demanding this product and a company has to hire more employees to meet our demand, yes, the price may go up slightly because of that. Inflation affects three things though: spending, saving, and investing. You're going to spend more money because prices are going up. So since you're spending more money, you're saving and investing less money. So you must save or invest in something that earns a higher rate than the rate of inflation, or you haven't really earned anything at all. So if you put your money in a savings account that has a 0.01% interest rate and inflation is 3%, your purchasing power of that money that's sitting in your savings account for potentially years is going down. Do not write this down. So this is what I was just talking about. From 1926 to 2014, so almost 90 years. Small company stocks averaged 12.2% return rate. Large company stocks were 10.1%. Government bonds were 5.7%, and treasury bills were 3.5%. Does that mean all small company stocks gave a return rate of 12.2%? No, some of them even weren't successful, but on average, that's what it came back as. During that same time, 1926 to 2014, the inflation rate was 2.9% on average. So if you had your money in cash assets, just a savings account, cash, you wouldn't be able to keep up with inflation. Where these other things, the rate of return is greater than inflation. This inflation winners and losers, you don't need to write this down. We're going to talk about all of these ways more when we get into chapter 10 on saving and investing. Just like you don't necessarily need to write down all of these percentages from that time period. Okay.